Good morning or afternoon, folks. Welcome back to some V-Rising. Today we're going to continue the developer blog breakdowns, and the next one we're going to tackle will be number 6, known as Build, Hunt, Rise, and number 7 called Progress Report. I read through these last night and I have to say that I'm really excited to cover the detail contained in them. The first blog was posted on September 22nd of last year. It starts off with a segment known as Dark Foundations. Like in many survival games, us players will find ourselves waking up in a hostile world with little to our names but the clothes on our backs. However, unlike in those games, we're the predator. Even though we could make do with tooth and claw, the hunger for a greater hunt will eventually drive us towards greater prey than the skeletons and ghouls of the starter area. This is going to require the most powerful weapons, the sturdiest protection, and a place to keep all of our equipment. But before we get to that, we'll need to start crafting. To get started with crafting, players will need to discover recipes and gather necessary ingredients to make use of them. We'll need to recover forgotten knowledge from the bloodlines of the lands, pillage them from NPCs and players alike, or even learn them through cooperation with allies. One thing I really like about this is that in the next part they say that it's actually possible for your teammates to learn recipes you've already researched through your crafting stations. This is a mechanic used to supplement having to play catch-up, which is what normally happens when you're a fresh player in a new server or survival game. I'm sure if you ever played a survival game, something like this can be an extreme relief. Because just one example, you're sitting there and you finally reach the point of undertaking a big project, and then you realize that the guy who makes cement paste isn't going to be online for the rest of the weekend, and you've already blown through the extra supply he left you. Just as an example, of course. But back to the blog. Here's where the castle comes in. They are the foundation of a vampire's progression and the base of their power. Castles can be raised almost anywhere in the world, except for unique points of interest. In these vampiric strongholds, you keep crafting stations, supplies, and your precious spawn point, the coffin. The vision of the castles is for them to be grand estates that represent your journey. As such, they'll be relatively small as players start out, but they hope to incentivize us to continue building and expanding them into something grand enough to reflect our progress. There might even come a point where an experienced vampire might feel the need to have multiple strongholds scattered across the world to better suit their expanding need and those of their kin. In the previous blog breakdown, we talked about how it will be interesting to see the competition we'll have with the map size they revealed, but now I'm wondering how it's really going to work if it'll be possible to take over multiple castles, and I also wonder if the Dracula mechanic could be related to this. The next segment is called Stalk the Night. The world of V-Rising is a persistent and lasting one, and they expect players to spend a good deal of time bringing our vampiric dreams to fruition and achieve not only the goals they set out, but the goals we set for ourselves. It's been a fun and exciting challenge for them to build an open world. Their goal is to create a rich world filled with wonders to engage in. Enemies will come in forms as simple as villagers who can barely defend themselves, to boss monsters powerful enough to push the limitations of your capabilities. Some resources can't be gathered and will need to be pillaged from NPC factions or animal corpses, and some skills will need to be hunted down and discovered. Their intention is to make these enemy encounters out in the world interesting. Depending on their level of intended difficulty, enemies will have a variety of different abilities and attack patterns that we'll have to adapt to if we want to survive. They mention that many of us who know some of their older titles like Battlerite might find ourselves in familiar territory. I just want to interject on that because I have been playing a little Battlerite to get an idea of what the combat might feel like, and I have to say that the game itself feels pretty smooth. The fast-paced action combat reminds me of old-school online fighting games like Rumble Fighter or Lost Saga. Not only do they want these sort of encounters to be fun to engage with, but they want players to feel motivated to seek out every level of play and be rewarded for it. From hunting down rare monsters or facing down challenging bosses, to cooling down by feeding on easier prey, building or gathering resources, they want every level of play to feel rewarding in its own right. Some people love feeling useful by keeping the castle supplied with essential resources. Some may feel like diving straight into a bandit camp and clearing the whole thing out but aren't as excited about upkeep. In this way, everyone can feel like they're contributing in their own right, and they aim to accommodate both solo play and team play. Also, speaking of which, the very next part is where they do confirm for us that we will be capable of creating private servers for solo or co-op adventures, alongside being able to join public servers that will have even more competition and cooperation. They state that the world is full of creatures and points of interest, and these places might serve as an opportunity to meet other vampires roaming the lands. And in the next section, titled Rise, Blood is Everything, they tell us that the vampire society is an engine that runs on blood. In the world of V-Rising, this is perhaps more true than in many other vampire-themed games. Blood isn't just what the undead drink to sustain themselves, but just like veins running through a body, blood pumps through every aspect of what makes an unholy empire run. In this game, blood will of course be obtained from the living beings that inhabit the world, and to get this blood, players will have to strike out into the world and take it. In the previous breakdown video, we talked about the different types of blood we'll come across, but also that we can expect to get it from other sources like rats. And letting our blood stores fall too low will cause ill effects and eventually lead to death if allowed to go on too long without filling the reserves. On top of that, there will be different qualities to the blood we're harvesting. Individual humans will have higher or lower qualities of blood, meaning hypothetically we could have two of the same unit, but one's blood might provide a greater buff than the other. Blood is also going to help develop abilities that we acquire out in the world. V-Rising is not a game with levels, class, or race like one might expect in an MMORPG. Variety will exist in the form of abilities that can be permanently unlocked, combined with more temporary abilities afforded by gear. One thing that does make me curious is the part where they say permanent abilities. They say that these abilities are more in line with your vampire nature and need to be developed to their full potential. I'm wondering and guessing that they're talking about skills that can be unlocked from a technology tree that persist on death. They say it'll be relatively easy to acquire enough of these skills and abilities for a player to fill out their skill bar and be able to stand toe-to-toe with other vampires or enemies in the world. However, if you want the specific variety that appeals to you the most, you'll have to do some hunting to acquire them. I'll have to do some more research on these, but I'm sure we'll find out how these work soon enough. They then finish off with information about the blood well. A vampire's castle is built on a foundation of blood magic. The blood well acts as a point to feed blood into. This reinforces the castle structure and prevents it from falling into disrepair. While the blood well is fed and maintained, our crafting stations will not only operate more effectively, but the castle defenses will be significantly more challenging to attack from the outside. So much so to the point that nobody will be able to attack your castle with just their claws or simple weapons alone. Which of course is probably a relief to most of you, including myself. Because if you played a game like Rust years ago on a public server, your base getting raided was pretty much a guarantee when you went offline, and even most times when you were online. Although one thing that would worry me about the system is that we're able to take over multiple castle locations. If you wanted to know life hard enough, I wonder if you could lock down at least 3 or 4 spots by yourself and keep them fed. And then you multiply that by 20 tryhards on one server, then you got about 60 to 80 spots all taken up. And then it begs the question of, do you need a castle to craft weapons capable of taking down other castle walls? It's very anecdotal evidence, but it's definitely food for thought because we have to think about clans and how there will most likely be alliances on top of the 4 regular players. And if you join an active server and all the spots are taken up and there's no way for you to attack them, it definitely limits your options a little bit. But granted, this concern can also be a double-edged sword depending on how you look at it, so we'll just have to see how it goes during the beta. They do say that while your castle can be assaulted, by default, they don't intend for it to be outright taken or particularly easy to tear down in its entirety. Although they would like to include that as a possible server option, so there's that too. This is part of what will make it necessary to constantly feed the blood well, something that will grow more difficult to do as you expand the size of your castle, and harder still with multiple locations. Not feeding it will lead to lower protection and possibly even slide into decay. On public servers, this will make it so players won't be able to keep taking up valuable real estate on a server if they move to another server or simply stop playing for a long period of time. And that's the end of number 6 as far as the blogs go. Let's jump right into number 7. And this one mostly just checks up on various staff members in the team, so there's a fair bit of detail we can probably skip. The first part goes over the arts and world building. They show a picture of an area known as the Swamplands, and it's a sub-biome of the Cursed Forest that their concept artist Victor has been working on. This area will remind you of the Cursed Forest, but with deep puddles of nasty swamp water, bugs, and nasty critters, which I hope means that we can fall into these puddles or throw other people into them and potentially die. Stalking through this area, we'll find the rotting remains of beasts that have been lured down into the foul waters of the swamp and now have fluorescent mushrooms growing out of them. We then follow up with one of the producers and lore masters, Max, who is collaborating with the art team to expand on some of the residents in the swamp, the witches. The witches of the Cursed Forest are primal creatures, magically able to twist nature to their own corrupt purpose. To this end, like most sentient creatures, they use this power to craft their homes. Their dens are a mix between the resilience of nature and the corrupt magic and rituals of their terrifying residents. In animation, they checked in with Albin. Albin was primarily working in Unity to make animation implementation easier for other animators on the team, as well as coming up with solutions for making our characters move more smoothly and gracefully. He went into a bit of his process for one of his recent animations for the game. For this burrowing rat, he started with what artists refer to as blocking, which nails down the overall pose and silhouette. Then they'll go on to animate the joints and limbs to add motion and a bit of personality. Finally, there are details like the claws curling into the ground and ears flopping. These are the little things that add realism and character to the gestures. We then come to the VFX artist Adrian, who has been working on the visual effects that really enforce a vampiric feel. One of Adrian's most recent projects is the Bloodwell that supports our castle. While visuals of the Bloodwell used to be fairly static, thanks to the VFX, there's now a completely visual representation of how full it is. And skipping down to the very last part I wanted to cover, which is by far my favorite, in this article they talk about gameplay, design, and technology. The gameplay and tech teams have made some pretty big leaps in defining their road system on the map. These road systems are a series of interconnected individual points throughout the map that non-playing characters and game systems can recognize. They can connect these points to create a road system with different traits. Some traits might be creating points of interest that players can't grief by building on to block travel. While they certainly had things like NPC patrols before, they were contained within individual chunks, which we did break down in the previous dev blog, and were fairly limited. But now the patrols can be global. This opens up all sorts of avenues for all sorts of interesting interactions, not just for wandering unique creatures to be found over wider areas of the world, but also things like patrolling boss monsters. And since the NPCs are capable of interacting with each other, this means that different factions of NPCs like bandits and militia guards might cross with each other and get into skirmishes. We might come across one of these fights, or even the aftermath of them getting unlucky enough to run into a boss themselves, as showcased in this picture. The next section even shows the junior technical artist piecing everything together to generate a mini-map visualization of the roads. These roads are going to add a lot of dynamic gameplay to our experience, because for example, we might even see a unique boss roaming around our castle one day, or a band of bandits that we need to take down. Really excited to see how this all plays out, but for the time being, that's everything we have to cover so far. Thank you all so much for joining me, and after the next breakdown, we will officially be all caught up aside from a couple minor ones we can talk about another time. Have a wonderful night or day, folks, and farewell.
Just